What's up, dogs? Need to know about the Canon 50mm f1.4, the f1.8, how they compare and which to get in this year 2020? The very, very short answer is to buy the 50mm f1.8 instead of the f1.4. Link is in the description below. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye. I kid. Obviously, there's some more nuance to that advice, but I don't need 20 minutes of your time to get to that punchline. So stick with me for the next few, and we'll cover 4 key decision points in order for us to get to that conclusion together. And if you're new here, my name is Dan Joshua, and I'm a creative entrepreneur. I spend my time making, learning, and monetizing, and I'd love to help you do the same as it relates to your photography and your creative endeavors. Deep technical specs aren't going to be a huge focus in this review. Instead, we're going to figure out how this 50mm fits in your lens lineup and whether or not you need the f1.4 as opposed to the f1.8, because that is what's most valuable to beginner and intermediate photographers like myself. And clearly I'm holding the f1.4 version in my hands, despite my earlier advice. So I'll use my story as a way to frame this discussion. First up is just to address the focal length of 50mm. Most people just starting out are going to have a crop sensor camera body. For Canon cameras, that means your image is going to crop in 1.6 times that of the full frame body equivalent using the same lens. So this 50mm on the Canon Rebel T7i acts really like an 80mm, and the 50mm on the full frame Canon RP, which I'm filming on now, acts like a true 50mm. That's important to understand because although the 50mm f1.8 makes for a great first lens, in fact it was mine, it's not the type of lens that you want to take on your first trip to Colorado in order to capture the vast scenery. I most certainly don't know anybody that has ever done just that. To be fair, even a true 50mm is not the type of lens that you want to bring on a trip like that if you can only pack one. Instead, something like a 35mm or a zoom lens with a wide focal range is better suited for a trip like that. The point is, just make sure you know that the 50mm on the crop sensor body is going to be good for isolating people and subjects, and not so good at including those people and subjects in their respective background surroundings. If instead you want a bit wider, still relatively bright, and super affordable first lens, try the 24mm Pancake. It's a 45mm full frame equivalent, and it's going to be much better as an all-around lens than the 50mm would be on a crop sensor body. The second thing to consider is whether you are primarily a photo or a video shooter. Are you a hybrid? Are you not sure? Besides dabbling in the YouTubes, I'm primarily a photo shooter first. The reason I ask is because the f1.8 version is a lot quieter as it focuses than the f1.4 version. If you're doing video work and you have a microphone mounted near or close to the camera, you're gonna wanna use the f1.8 version instead of this noisier f1.4. So if you plan to do a lot of video work with the 50mm lens that you end up getting, definitely check out the f1.8. So let's say you know you want the 50mm more so than something wide, and you know you're a photo shooter more than you shoot video. At this point in the decision tree, you might still be considering this f1.4. My next question would be how often you plan to shoot indoors with this lens, or in especially low light conditions, and how much you want that sweet bokeh from the f1.4 as opposed to the f1.8. If you plan to shoot a lot indoors, or you just happen to be a bokeh fiend, then you might still consider the f1.4. But my most important caution of this entire video is that this lens, wide open at f1.4, is not known for its stellar image quality. When it's wide open at f1.4, the contrast isn't great, the edges are soft, and there's a lot of noticeable chromatic aberration. Image quality starts improving as soon as you start stopping down, as it does with most lenses. But if you are a new shooter and you've never shot f1.4 and you're expecting something magical to happen when you open from f1.8 to f1.4, you're gonna be sorely disappointed. You can still get nice results when you're completely wide open. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just not phenomenal. And if you're expecting a completely different look than the cheaper f1.8 counterpart, that's not going to be what you get with this f1.4. More experienced shooters probably already know this, but it was kind of a hard lesson that I had to learn, and if it saves anybody else, I wanted to mention that here as well. And finally, getting to the value-price ratio, the f1.4 lens costs roughly 3 times the price as the cheaper nifty 50 f1.8. And I don't think you're gonna find many people that agree that you'd be getting 3 times the performance out of this particular lens. Given that this is an aging lens, I think it might make more sense if it cost around $200 or $225 especially for photo first shooters. Early in my journey, I did trade up from the f1.8 to grab the f1.4, and I did expect 3 times the performance, and I think that's why I've been a little bit disappointed with this lens in particular. I'm enjoying it much more when I adapt to the Canon RP, and have been using it a lot lately, but I think a big reason for that is not necessarily because of the lens, but just because it's the smallest one that I have in my kit to be able to carry around. Because I have the 50mm focal length covered in the zoom range of the lens that I have on the camera right now, I'll probably look to sell this in favor of perhaps the RF35 f1.8, just so that I can have something that fits in this footprint, but is a little bit wider. Either way, if you're buying new, go with the Canon 50mm f1.8. If you're buying used, DM me on Instagram and pick up this f1.4. But either way, enjoy shooting with your 50mm primes. There is another EF 50mm f1.2, and if you've got a sack of money lying around that you can't wait to get rid of, go ahead and just pick up that one. If you're looking for shots that are tighter than what you can achieve with the 50mm focal length, check out this video on the Canon 100mm macro. It's my absolute favorite lens.